Pam Shannon and Marley Smith from the Integrated Education Services team of Erie 2 Chautauqua Cattaraugus BOCES. This video is about scribing for test accommodations. We have included information both from New York State Education Department guidance and tips and tricks to make scribing as easy and as efficient as possible. So your student is eligible for a scribe, and it is noted on either their IEP or their 504 accommodation plan. And similar to any other type of accommodations, the IEP and 504 documents should be very specific in how and what the scribe should be included for each student. For example, some students might only have scribing for written passages or the written notes for mathematics. Some students may have it specifically mentioned that the scribe should be bubbling in for multiple choice as well. One of the most important things to note for scribing is that it should be available for all assessments that each student takes. We're talking about the New York State assessments, the Regents assessments, district, building, and any teacher-created assessments that the student is given throughout the year. What about a student with a hearing impairment, though? The person who's signing for them, are they translating it as well? And the answer to this is yes. But generally, the student that would have this accommodation would also have additional disabilities. Now the question is, when do we scribe? And here again, this should be consistently implemented throughout the school year on every single assessment that the student takes, from the beginning of September to the end of June. The only exception to this rule is for any kind of diagnostic assessment such as iReady, STAR, AimsWeb, where you're trying to see not only how the student is growing throughout the year, but also if you're trying to see where they may need additional assistance, AIS support, or new strategies to further help this student. Now, many aides and special education teachers frequently will take notes to assist a student, and there's a big difference between general note-taking and scribing. When you're taking notes, you're trying to get the gist of what the teacher is saying so that you can make interpretations, you can infer, and you're taking notes to definitely facilitate the student's understanding. None of this comes into play when we are scribing on assessments. The student needs to communicate clearly all of their ideas to the scribe, whose job it is to write down verbatim, but without any analysis, without any inferences made from what the student is actually saying. When we scribe in ELA, we do not put any capitalization, any grammar, or punctuation. We'll get to that in a minute. When the scribe accurately writes down what the student is saying verbatim, this is going to allow the student's voice and knowledge to come through in the notes that the scribe is taking. So we've written up a checklist. Generally you use lined paper, but if you have an older student who speaks very quickly, you may want to type this. But when you set up the document, triple space it and print it immediately when the student is finished, as you'll see why this is important in a minute. If you don't have access to a printer, then typing it may not be feasible. On lined paper or typing, you are going to enter exactly what the student says word for word. On ELA, you will leave out any punctuation, capitalization, and at the end you're going to circle the difficult words that are over grade level. This is important because the student will then have to spell these words for you. Once you've done this, the student is going to read out loud their response, and you will ask them where they should capitalize, punctuate, even write paragraphs for an extended response. Then finally, you're going to write the student's final response directly into the test booklet if this is a Regents or a 3 through 8 New York State ELA exam. And finally, staple the original scribed sheet from the student directly into the New York State test book. So what makes a good scribe? Number 1 is understanding the complete process and practicing it well before the exam. Knowing exactly where the student is going to work and how well they are going to work with you on this is also important. Gaining the confidence of the student so the two of you have clear communication is key to being a successful scribe. Also, you may have to write very quickly, so the more practice you have to work with the student, the better it is going to work for both of you. Lastly, if this is a chemistry or algebra exam, the scribe's knowledge of the subject and being familiar with the vocabulary, terminology, and diagrams is also key to being a good scribe. How do we prepare for the assessment? Well, if you've worked with one another before, it makes it much easier. If you're not familiar with the content, you might want to have a list of the vocabulary and other specific content information right next to you. Knowing what is allowed versus not allowed when scribing for both the student and the scribe is important. Now, the last item is especially important if you are scribing the Regents or the New York State assessment, to have copies of the test for both the student and the scribe. This can be helpful, so while the student is reading the passage or question, the scribe can be reading at the same time. This makes the job easier for the scribe to better understand what the student is trying to tell you. So here's a first example, and notice on the top that the student's name, the question number, the date, and specifically which assessment is written, and in this case specifically book 3. Because we are going to attach this to the test, and we all know what happens when you staple something to paper. Sometimes it comes off and we don't want them to get lost. In this example, you can see that there are no capital letters, there's no punctuation. We are writing exactly what the student said to us. Now we get to the part where the student is finished. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to circle all the difficult words that are at grade level that the student might have difficulty with. Without showing the paper to the student, you're going to ask them to spell each word you circled. And because we've skipped lines on this paper, you'll be able to write directly above the circled word exactly how the student spelled it. Next, you're going to show the completed work to the student, and you're going to ask them for the H and he at the beginning of the paragraph should be capitalized. They will have to tell you that. You cannot prompt them. You will ask them where to put periods or other punctuation without specifically suggesting to them anything. Write the changes directly on this scribed sheet. Now, once the student has completed all of their edits, adding everything that they would like to, then later you're going to copy that directly into, in this case, this is the New York State test booklet. And notice that in this case, the 3 words that they misspelled, the misspelling goes into the test booklet exactly as they said. So this accurately and completely captures exactly what the student intended, mistakes and all. Then you're going to take the original sheet that you wrote out with the student's help completing it, and you're going to staple it to the back page in the test booklet. Sounds really easy, doesn't it? Well, when we were putting together this video, you see 3 crumpled sheets of paper here, which is actually the tip of the iceberg. And when you think about it as adults, we automatically capitalize things. We automatically put a capital I when speaking about ourselves. We automatically do so much that is much easier to do with lots and lots of practice. We've put together a scribe checklist for you that may make it easier so that you don't forget anything. This file will have been uploaded to the same folder in case you need to print one out and you begin to use it. Now we get to mathematics, which you would think would be easier because it's numbers and symbols than ELA. Well, guess again. For mathematics, as the student dictates the numbers, we actually have to write the words. We can write the symbols out, but the student is then going to need to show us what to write exactly so that the mathematical practices are accurately contained in the student's work. When you're talking about place value in some of the younger grades, you'll actually have to ask them how to line up the numbers. For operational signs, when the student says addition or subtraction, we will have to ask them what symbol do they exactly mean. When the student says 1038, the student is specifically going to have to tell us to write a 1, a 0, a 3, and an 8. Because if they miss that 0, the number is actually very different. Sometimes they get into computational problems. For example, when you're adding 23 and 9, the student actually has to tell you place value 9 plus 3 equals 12, put down the 2 and carry the 1 above, thereby indicating they know the correct procedure. For math, the student doesn't have to spell anything correctly, and they don't have to worry about punctuation and word responses. So when you scribe this, as you'll see in the next slide, you don't have to worry about the punctuation or the capital letters. So the student here dictated 2 over 6 multiplied by 2 over 2 equals 4 over 12. Notice how the scribe wrote what is in black, and this is exactly what the student said. Now, the students might have said 2, 6. We understand as adults that this indicates a fraction, but we need the student to specifically tell us how they want us to write the numbers. When the student tells you multiplied, you'll need to ask them exactly which symbol you are supposed to write. Now in this example, the red is what would have been written down on the scribed piece of paper after your conversation with the student. And you may write one example down and the student will correct it, so you simply cross it off and rewrite it until the student tells you that yes, those numbers and symbols are correct. Now this was a 2-point question, and the second portion of the question required the student to answer in words. Notice how in this case the capital letters and the punctuation were added for the student, because they do not have to worry about that on the mathematics test. Right next to where it says show your work on the attached page, this is where you have copied the student's work from the other sheet. Notice that we didn't copy the words, we just copied the final mathematics that the student indicated. In this next example, the student dictated the top part written in black. 820,445 is greater than 805,235. The scribe needs to write the words down greater than and not the symbol, because the student is going to have to help to indicate to us exactly how that symbol should be written. Another difficulty in this problem is that in the 805,235, the student is going to have to tell us to write an 8 followed by the 0, indicating that they really do understand the place value that is involved. They also should tell you where to write the comma, and if they don't, you simply leave it out. In the second part of this problem, also on place value, the student would have had to have dictated write 800,000 and underneath that write 20,000 in order for you to have written down exactly what you see, because if they don't tell you to write it underneath, you would have to write it next to. Now you're beginning to see a little bit more about why math can be a little bit more problematic, and practicing this both on your own and with the student is really critical in order to capture exactly what the student is thinking. Here is the entry from the completed work for the second problem that we did after the conversation with the student. Here's the Mathematics Scribe checklist, which does not have what's in the ELA about capitalizing and punctuation, and it is a little bit shorter, even though math takes longer. Remember, if it's on the Regents or the New York State test booklet, you always record the student's final response directly in the test booklet, and don't forget to staple the original scribe sheet into that same booklet. So, where did we get these practice questions? Well, we went to the release question guides, which will actually have copies of student work that we were able to use for practice. So it's your turn now, and we hope that you have enough time to practice with your student before the exam. Here are some of the guidance docs that we used from the State Education Department for you in case you would like to review any of this. Some of these files will also be placed in the folder so that you don't have to go searching for them. Thank you, and if you have any questions, please feel free to call the staff developers and data specialists that support Erie 2 directly, and that would be Rebecca Downley or Stacy Conti. Good luck scribing!